That's not the job, right? The star of the show is the client. And the job of the lawyer is to get the outcome that the client wants. They sell persuasiveness. And with deals, it's a certain kind of persuasiveness because unlike the lawyers that you see on TV in the courtroom, we are win-win people thinking that you can do M&A on your own. The reality is you'll just get eaten up if you try and do M&A on your own, especially business owners who are so good at the thing they do. And then suddenly there's this other thing that's just so alien. If I break my leg, I'm not going to try and fix it myself. There's a general sentiment that Donald Trump is good for business. He's low on reg. He's, good for monetary policy. Things are going to be great. Everybody rushes off and starts doing deals. And then I guess my question is, well, is he good for business? Because he's so...
I'm Josh Comrie and welcome to Two Commas, the multi-million-dollar exit show. It's summer 2025, that's why I'm double linening today. And today on the show, in line with that theme, we have Neil Millar. Neil's a partner at MinterEllison and he specialises in M&A lawyering. So season 2 is all about kind of circling around the ecosystem as it relates to the M&A kind of space. And so we'll always talk to founders, but today we've got Neil on the show and I'm really excited because Neil's a bit of a heavy hitter in the space. He's been recognised in his market as being one of the leaders, one of the main kind of proponents, protagonists, and he also has a podcast himself, but I'll let him talk about that later. So Neil, really pleased to have you on the show. Welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm only single lineing today, but hopefully we'll get through with just the one layer.
We should be fine, nonetheless.
Yeah.
So you wrote a recent report on M&A in New Zealand, and you described it as being bumpy and grumpy. Tell me why.
That's right. So we do this M&A forecast every year. It's a look back at the last 12 months. So that's the 2024 year, and then we try to make some predictions about the year ahead. And that's because a very clever business development director once told me, you should always have an opinion about something. Nobody really cares whether you're right or not. So we make sure that every year we have a strong opinion about what's going to happen in the M&A space. And it has been really bumpy and grumpy for a couple of years now. And what we mean by that is that deals are just, there's deals, they're happening, but they're taking longer. More of them are falling over. They're dragging out. The negotiations are tenser. It's just a harder process at the moment.
Okay. And so statistically speaking, if you were able to kind of quote some stats to us to bring that to life a little bit more, what does the data tell you about the deals that have been done over the last couple of years?
Yeah, so if you think about volumes, which is what we look at in particular, let's go back a few years. So 2020, 2021, we had our COVID years, and off the back of COVID, there was a huge surge in activity, sort of decade-long highs, and it's been declining since then. Last year, there was an uptick. So globally, the commentators reported a 15% uptick in activity, and we saw that. So we look at Merger Market, which is an aggregator of information data. In the 23 year, they reported 113 deals that fit their kind of demographic for a deal. And last year it was about 156. So it's following that global trend. We think it's going to get a lot bigger this year, but it has still been grumpy. It's still been hard.
Yeah.
When
you talk about that number of deals, you're talking about within the New Zealand
economy?
New
Zealand, New Zealand deals.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if we scan back from that and look at the macro picture, you said that does kind of reflect globally.
Yeah.
So are the trends pretty much exactly the same, or what are the differences between New Zealand and international?
So we're often trying to establish what are the trends in New Zealand and why, what's driving, activity or lack of activity. So if we look at those global trends, a lot of it does translate into New Zealand. So if for no other reason than something like half of all our deals that we would do involve an international investor or an international buyer coming on shore. So obviously they're affected by global trends. And last year was just this massive year of uncertainty globally. So 50 elections worldwide, including, of course, the big one.
That'll be new, not New Zealand, obviously.
Mr. Trump is now in power.
Indeed.
So the commentators will tell you that on a global basis, the two of the real drivers for M&A is certainty around monetary policy, certainty around regulatory settings. And so with 50 elections, lots of uncertainty, and then a big surge once all those 50 elections had happened. And of course, with Mr. Trump in, a general sentiment that it was going to be good for business. I think the global head of M&A for JP Morgan at that point, sort of October, November, is in an interview saying, well, better people are now willing to invest because it's better to trade on hope than wait for reality. So there's a big sense that everything's, so we saw a huge surge in that kind of October, November, December period. So here in New Zealand, I think we see some of that impact. Others will tell you, buyers will tell you, actually, they're probably just more focused on trading, and trading's not been good in New Zealand. Businesses have not done so well last year, so that's the reason for the caution. That's the reason for the bumpy and grumpy. Although you could argue that those macroeconomic trends are impacting the trading as well. So there you go. The other thing is, but then what tends to happen within jurisdictions is there is. In this case, New Zealand-specific things that are happening that impact. And in particular, we think this year, there's actually a lot of regulatory change being foreshadowed, which we think is net positive. And actually, the M&A space is not a particularly legal-heavy space, so there's not often much for us to talk about there. But this time round, there's really quite a lot of things happening, and they're all kind of looked at together. They seem to be net positive for M&A. So there's a little bit. I think that's a long-winded way of saying there's a little bit of both, right? There's a little bit of macroeconomic influence, and then there's some local conditions that I think will also help.
Yeah, got it. Interestingly, in New Zealand, we've just kind of coming through perhaps the back end, perhaps not, a recessionary period which has been longer and deeper than the GFC, which was the 2008 to 2010 period. And it's been fairly brutal for a lot of business owners and probably a lot of this audience as well. Picking up on a comment that you made about the head of JP Morgan, the words were better to trade on hope than to wait for reality. Do you echo those sentiments? And does that mean that the reality may not be as good as the hope?
So much of this is in the American context, right? So I guess the comment that she made when she made that comment was, we're talking about Donald Trump, right? So he's got into power. There's a general sentiment that Donald Trump is good for business. He's low on reg. He's good for monetary policy. Things are going to be great. Everybody rushes off because they've been waiting with it sitting on their hands. Rushes off and starts doing deals, and then I guess my question is, well, is he good for business? Because he's so unpredictable. So there's this beautiful period before when he's been elected and he hasn't taken the seat yet, when there's lots of activity happening. So we saw that a lot of it, as I said before, a lot of activity before Christmas. Our pipelines got very full. We've been instructed in a whole heap of new deals for 2025 already. But then 1 month in, and some of those deals are slowing down. Some of those deals are falling over. We're starting to fight about price. And I suppose if you're sitting here in New Zealand and the Don is talking about tariffs and, is he going to start a world war? And, so I'm not sure that he is good for business, or he does provide that stability that that these kind of investors are looking for. I don't know. I guess we'll find out. The other side of it, from my perspective, is that, if he is bad news, it might be good for investment here because we're quite far away from all that. We're quite a stable economy. We're quite sensible people. People can understand what our regulatory framework looks like. So maybe that's going to help us for M&A. And certainly, we've seen increased interest. The Visa Active Investor Plus stuff. We've got loads of inbound inquiries from Americans all the time. The billionaires want to move here. We've seen the big private equity funds over the last few years, for reasons I can talk about later. Perhaps we're seeing them taking a lot more interest in New Zealand as a place to invest, much more than in the past. So maybe we'll be a little bit of a haven. I don't know.
Tina and I were talking about last night the Chinese Navy doing its flex just off the coast of Australia at the moment. And we were kind of joking and about how we should be pretty safe in New Zealand. If anyone's going to get invaded close by, it's going to be Australia. We don't have the resources that they do, and their coastline's a bit bigger than ours. They do have a military of their own. But and also there was a meme joke that was about New Zealand's Defence Force sending off a canoe with a couple of guys with a dozen spates and a couple of vapes, and New Zealand was going to trade on its being nice kind of thing, which is an interesting sideline. Let's not get distracted by that. But
I think we just want to send our equivalent of the intelligence services to infiltrate Google and just slowly remove New Zealand from Google Maps, and it'll take them years to find us, won't it?
Perfect.
That'd be the perfect
Yep.
solution.
It took years to find us in the first place.
Exactly.
Let's just repeat that exercise
just
again.
Quietly fade into the Pacific.
Wrapping up that commentary on the Don, I think the thing that we can be sure of is that the Don will be good for his business, and his pocket will certainly get lined as an experience of being in the White House. Hopefully that won't get me on a hit list anywhere.
Trump stakes are back.
Yes, indeed. So you mentioned that there is some regulatory changes underway in New Zealand. That's obviously through the virtue of the government that is in the House at the moment and kind of pushing a whole lot of different things through, which are hopefully pro-business. Can you talk through, a couple of three of those key points?
Yeah. So and it's interesting, right? So as Kiwis, we like to whinge about regulation, right? We
like to whinge.
We think it's terrible. It's actually pretty good relative to the rest of the world, and we're a pretty easy regime. But sentiment is important and perception is important. So this government is coming out and saying all the right things about making New Zealand a good place to invest. And if we start with the biggest pain point for international investors is our overseas investment regime. So we call it the OIO, and you'll have read all the articles in the paper. These are Crafer Farms and beyond, which makes it hard for investors to invest into New Zealand. Without going into too much detail, there's kind of two triggers for an OIO consent. There's a sort of a deal size trigger, which is in most cases $100 million plus deals. And there's this idea of a sensitive land trigger. So this is certain types of land that it should be a privilege to own, which is your farmland and your vineyards and your seabed and your foreshore and your these days your residential property as well. There's very different criteria for how you get a consent to do one or other of those two types of deals. On the deal size one, it's really just what we call a responsible investor test. It's basically that you're not organized crime, that you're good for the money, that the Google checks, check out, and that really, you've got a sensible business plan. It kind of really quite simple.
It's like the sniff test.
Yeah, and whereas for sensitive land, this is the one that's always in the papers because you have to demonstrate a sort of a benefit to New Zealand by this international investor owning this piece of land that will be over and above what a Kiwi owner could have presented, and that's where you've got your Kiwi sanctuaries being built next door, and you're extending the local school and all this kind of stuff, right? And that impacts on M&A because if you are buying a business that has one of these interests in a lease or owns sensitive land, then you have to go through both. You have to go through that process, and potentially the other one as well if you've got a big deal. So which impacts our agribusinesses, it impacts our forestry businesses, infrastructure, anything that's got sizable tracts of land involved in the business, right? So the changes that Seymour are foreshadowing is to essentially, I won't go into too much detail, but essentially remove, in most cases, other than just straight up farmland, fishing quota, residential property, which will kind of stay the same, but remove that benefits test and flip it on its side. And I think his rhetoric, which he's been talking about in the papers, is we're open for business unless there's a good reason not to. So it's a kind of a national interest test, and if you tick the box on national interest, there's no identifiable national interest risk in you investing, then you're going to get to do it. The other thing that they're talking about is a really quite material reduction in the time it takes to process. So the biggest bugbear for us lawyers is that these OIO processes can take 6 or 9 months. And although I've never actually presided over an application that we didn't get the consent for, that makes you quite unattractive as a bidder in a bid process relative to a local bidder, because you're essentially having to signal to the seller it's going to take 6 to 8 months before I can do your deal. I can buy your company. They're going to reduce that down to 15 working days, they say. So that's really good. So while I don't think OIO actually gets in the way of M&A, because more often than not we get through and we get the consent, I think perception-wise it's going to be really important, because we can now go to our clients internationally and say we can get you through this process really quite quickly. Yeah. So that's a big plus. I'll come back to the Commerce Commission changes because they're potentially negative. But the other stuff around the edges, so KiwiSaver, so there are some changes, some quite technical changes that are coming through that are designed to make it easier for KiwiSavers to do direct investing, and it's mainly around the fact that you as a punter in KiwiSaver, you can go online and work out what the value of your portfolio is today, because there's a whole bunch of rules in place that say that every stock and share that's listed is going to be valued at the end of every day, and then they can peg the value on a daily basis. Private equity investments are illiquid investments. Direct investments are illiquid investments. They're very hard to value. You can't value them on a daily basis because it can be 3 to 5 years between when you actually have a liquidity event, right? So there's some rules changing to allow KiwiSavers to be able to tolerate ownership of private assets a bit easier, and that's hopefully going to encourage our big KiwiSaver operators to get into private equity, to get into some direct investing. Some of them already do, but this will make it a lot easier for them to do. So that's a plus, and we think that's a good idea. I mean, I want my pension investing in private equity. It's one of the best returning classes of assets there are, right? And then probably the other one that's worth talking about is the Active Investor Plus changes. So they're this experiment around providing a kind of direct investment type of model. Back in the day, it used to just be you chuck $10 million into a performance, to a bond, and you were and that was you in. And then they changed the rules to say you had to be an active investor. You had to go and do active investments. It's actually very hard to match them up, so that those kind of applications have massively fallen away. They're making that a lot easier. So there's a reduced threshold for kind of more growth type investing. So that's down to 5 million. For 10 million, you can. There's a wider class of assets that you can get involved in. They're removing things like the English language test, right? So we actually have clients that tell us that that's a huge barrier, because basically billionaires get offended if you tell them that if you want to come live in New Zealand, somebody has to pass judgment on your ability to speak English. So we take that away, and the idea is that they'll be more inclined to park their money with us. So those are the key ones that are in the plus.
That's really helpful and insightful, and actually unexpected to delve into that. Thanks for your commentary on that, and I did ask for it. I'm a good friend of AJ Burtonshaw, who's the founder of Serato, and he was a victim of the OIO process last year. And reflecting upon it, it was such an unfortunate outcome to experience, because that's at the very back end of the deal due diligence, right? You don't go for OIO approval at the very start. You've gone through all your efforts and the hard work and the analysis and the breaking down of everything, and you kind of get the sale and purchase sorted out, and then you go to the OIO, is my understanding, and to then have it shut down based upon essentially it was a claim that was made by an American billionaire that this was going to be anti-competitive, which was kind of using the law in really unusual ways to be able to satisfy his needs, not the needs of kind of the what the act was set up to achieve in the first place, is my understanding of it.
Yes, so the Serato, we were involved in the Serato deal. Yeah, we acted for the buyer, or the proposed buyer, out of our Wellington office. We think that particular decision was a shocking decision. Yeah. Yeah, I probably can't go into too much detail, but the in terms of what's publicly available there, the very strange thing about that transaction is that the issue was a competition issue. So the person you were talking about that complained was complaining based on anti-competitive, so merger control issues. And the OIO in the final hour decided to make it a condition of their consent that a clearance was given by the Commerce Commission, which to my knowledge is the first time that one agency has tried to make it a condition of their part of the consenting function to require another agency to consent to something. The Commerce Commission is perfectly capable of stepping into the fray itself, but because the OIO made it a condition of its consent to get a clearance, that forced the buyer to have to go and try and get a clearance from Comcom as well, and that's where it fell over.
Yeah, right.
And which we consider to be overreach on the part of OIO. But but it's a good illustration. These sorts of things do not play well internationally when people find out about them, and so we are all for anything that makes it easier. Yes, under the new rules, that probably wouldn't have happened.
Right, that was going to be my question.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Let's loop back around here, Neil. So you're a partner at MinterEllison, which is one of the country's leading law firms. And so as an M&A advisor there, what do you do?
What do I do? That's a good question. So I guess what do the lawyers do on an M&A transaction, I guess is the first question, isn't it? So what do we do? We think of it like a project. So we're project managers, probably first and foremost. So it's a very specialist area, and so you come to us as a buyer or a seller to handle all the legal aspects of your transaction. And so, I mean, what do I sell is the question. So project management, because a transaction normally impacts lots and lots of areas of the law, or lots of legal areas, because you're trying to understand the nature, if you're a buyer, what you're buying, or respond, if you're a seller, to the areas that the buyer is concerned about. So we would coordinate. Sometimes I could have 50 or 60 lawyers on a large transaction, involved in a large transaction. So it's project management, and it is also a large process, right? So there's a lot of stages to it, and there's a lot of hoops to jump through for a big transaction. The end result on a big transaction can be a boardroom table with 80 documents on it that need to be signed. So there's a big component of just managing the process through, and then there's the obvious stuff. So negotiation. So we will help negotiate the terms of a transaction. So I guess at some level I sell persuasiveness, and with deals it's a certain kind of persuasiveness, because unlike the lawyers that you see on TV in the courtroom, that's a win-lose type of situation. We're win-win people. Our job is to get two parties to be happy, because there's really only two ways that a deal gets done. Everyone's happy or equally pissed off. But
still prepared to do the deal.
I assume I can swear on this.
Yes, you can.
Yeah. So our job is to get people in the middle. Our job is to understand how what's driving the other side's requests, and our job is to broker and get deal and get consensus, I suppose. And then there's the drafting piece. So obviously we generate M&A deals generate 150 page documents. And they're complex, and they're full of words and provisions and obligations and risks and liabilities, and our job is to navigate all that and to write and to correctly write down what everybody thinks they've agreed, and to anticipate what the ins and outs of what they're being asked to agree might be. So we also sell experience, and we sell solutions. We sell, how do you, when we've got an impasse on a deal, how do we break the impasse? What's the solution? How can we work out what it is that you want and what I want, and how can we find something that will work for both of us that will get us through that impasse? So we sell a bit of that, and then we move through into sort of more functional stuff towards the end, where we do completions, and we generate all the other bits of paper, and we handle the money, and we run that final run into the company changing hands, and then we take everybody out for lunch and give them champagne.
Hopefully, yes,
That's it.
yes, yeah.
So as I suppose I'm the head of our division, and I guess my job is to coordinate. My division has 14 partners and 60 staff, so we coordinate. I guess on top of that, all of our business development and our HR and all the rest of it. But as an M&A lawyer, I'm the partner on the file, so buck stops with me, and I'll run a team, and I'll generally be the guy at the table, and I'm always the guy signing off on the documents, and I'm often the person trying to come up with the solutions. And I guess the other thing that we do as project managers, as M&A, is we translate, because almost every deal is different. And there's always an issue that emerges, and it might be a tax issue, or it might be a property issue, or it might be an intellectual property issue, or any number of things. And so I'll have an expert that's a deep expert in that area, and my job is to turn whatever they tell you into something that normal people would understand, and then put it in the context of a larger transaction. Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Everything you said, other than the very first point that you made, is what I expected. So I'm going to scratch the surface a little bit there. Okay. So project manager is what you said. So my exposure to and experience of project management is that obviously you've got to be clear on the scope and the time frame. Relationship management and expectation management is actually often two of the most important things, plus having really strong communication skills. So tell me more about those kind of three aspects there, if you could.
Yeah, so I mean... we get involved in all sizes of deals. Some deals it's $500,000. We're buying a corner shop. It's pretty straightforward, and then sometimes it's a $1 billion process that takes 12 months, and everything in between. So I guess in terms of that project management, there is a big piece around that, because we'll have the clients. I'm typically a private sort of deal guy, so I tend to either act for sellers, private owners of businesses selling, or these days I act for a lot of private equity funds that invest into these kinds of businesses. So the first thing, of course, is I think the whole purpose of your podcast is this private space. It's full of personalities. It's full of people who own and love their business and the people in it. So there's a big piece at the start of just they don't know what they don't know. They'll be nervous. So the project manager has to get across them and get their confidence and get their trust and let them know it's going to be okay, and we're going to get this deal done for you and everything's going to be fine. So there's that piece. And then there's, in a decent sized deal, there's other advisors involved. So there's normally going to be some kind of investment bank. And there's going to be one of the big four accountants that are going to do the due diligence around financials and tax and the rest of it. So there's coordination with all of them, and so you're right. It is a bit like a project, right? So you sit down, you have your initial meetings, you scope. We're often asked how much they're going to cost. We have very different attitudes from clients to that sort of side of things. Sometimes we're asked to put a very detailed scope together with a cost, sometimes even fixed. Other times they're comfortable that they know and trust us, and that it'll end up being what it ends up being. The thing about that's almost certain with maybe it's the same I've only ever done projects in the M&A space, but I'm sure it's the same in other projects, is the one thing that's almost for certain is whatever our scope is was not going to end up being what we end up doing. Just deals have a life of their own. They go in different directions. They go at different paces. A lot of it depends on the other side. Some of it depends on how reasonable your own clients are feeling. So we have to caveat our scopes. We provide estimates. We make assumptions, and in all the usual way. So we do quite a big scoping exercise, and then there's reporting against throughout the transaction, just to keep the clients appraised at where things have got to on the cost front. And like any good project, a big deal, we'll have regular team call. And when I say team calls, I mean the whole the sell side or the buy side team. So the principals, the clients, the other advisors. There'll be a weekly check-in normally in a big deal. Where are we getting? How are we going across all these fronts? What's happening with the legals? What's happening with the tax? What's happening with the financials? How the site visit's going, and so we're heavily involved in all that. And we get to we have to document manage. We have these large sale and purchase agreements. There's version control to think about. There's a process around that. We have a very process-driven piece around completion. So the minute we have a signed agreement, we'll produce a very long checklist of these are all the things that need to get done between now and completion. We'll engage with our counterparts on the other side, and it's very like a project from that point. You start working your way towards an agreed date to get all those bits of paper, all the things that need to be done are done.
Once you break it down on that basis, it's no surprise for people that are galled by the potential duration of these deals, that is the deal of complexity that sits in behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And a question for you is that the folk that you've mentioned, a lot of those characters can be quite strong characters. So founders of a company, through the virtue of getting there, you've got to have some character, some backbone about you. Acquirers of businesses, they're probably quite strong. Investment bankers are not known to be the shy, retiring types. Maybe the accountancy firms, the partners inside those firms, I've met a number of them over the years, they're also quite strong characters. Yeah. So there are a lot of big personalities in and around the table, and the style that I'm getting from you, Neil, is intelligence, conciliatory, informed and clearly very prepared. Is that the way you approach dealing with these characters, or is there something different?
No, it is. So that's a good point. So I guess there is a stereotype, isn't there, which is some sort of arrogant lawyer, point scorer. It's all about the lawyer, and those people exist. They are out there. I did 8-9 years in London and the US before I came to New Zealand, and I'll tell you, in London they're there in spades, right? But that's not the job, right? So. And what I tell my juniors and my team is that our job. So the star of the show is the client, right? And the job of the lawyer is to get the outcome that the client wants. And so it's not about me; it's about them. So I always say to the juniors, think of yourself as being one step to the behind and to the left, or one step and behind and to the right. Whispering in the ear. That's the job of the lawyer. Now, having said that. You have to have presence in a meeting because you know what your client wants, but by definition, your client's good at whatever it is that they've made their millions building. I'm the one they've bought to get the outcomes for them. So you have to be able to assert yourself in a meeting. You have to be able to put forward a strong and convincing argument. In the New Zealand context, what I believe you have to avoid is being arrogant, having a fight, being aggressive, because it's a very small market, and everybody knows everybody, and so I've always taken the approach, and most of my colleagues in the other firms that I deal with would agree with this, which is that our job is to work together to get a deal done, that win-win, and that breaks down if you start getting overly positional as a lawyer. So we try and avoid that if we can. Sometimes you get into a fight, but you're trying to avoid it if you can, because that's not, in my opinion, the most productive thing for the end goal, which is everyone's happy, shakes hands, and gets the deal done. In court, that's great. Go for it, right? Because there's going to be a loser and there has to be a winner. So that's what you're aiming for. But that's not the job in M&A, is my view.
Yeah, got it. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So far less posturing and much more about kind of navigating your way towards the agreed outcome that you have at the outset, and putting. I really love the description that you used there. The client is the star of the show. So that sounds like a very pragmatic way to approach things. So you've talked through some of the kind of high level things that you do from a kind of legal consideration, legal process basis. For my audience, which is founders and owners of companies and entrepreneurs, what would you say, without kind of spending a week going through a lecture process of what the key aspects of the legalities of a deal are? What are the kind of top 2-3 kind of things that people should be aware of if they're considering going into a sale process at some stage into the future from a legal standpoint?
So you, in terms of how does the process work?
Let's talk about that first.
Yeah. So I guess it's not a long conversation, right? So there are if you want to think about the stages, the first stage is deciding you want to sell, and then getting ready for it, and that sometimes you don't have time for that because somebody comes out of nowhere and offers you. But in an ideal scenario, that's your first stage, getting ready for it, and there's legal aspects to that, which is get your house in order, and which we can talk about in more detail later maybe. And then there's the I guess the next stage is the dance, which is the either you go through a formal bid process where you engage an advisor to go and find bidders for you, and you produce an information memorandum, and you start to build some interest in the asset. But assuming that you've got through that stage and somebody emerges, that the dance is the get to know you period. There's not very legally heavy, that bit. We're generally not involved. That's going out for dinners and doing site visits, and probably the most important thing for most buyers is are these people are fit for our business? Is this going to work? Operationally, does it work? Does it stack up? And then there's a more formal piece around the first, probably the time that we would properly get involved would be normally there's a term sheet of some description. So we're gonna write down the main principles of our deal on a bit of paper to see if we've got a meeting of the minds. My plea to everyone would be get your lawyer involved in that document, because although it's normally considered to not be legally binding, first of all you have to make sure that you've understood that's the case. But the other thing is you're setting down principles for a transaction which may cause you problems in the heat of the deal when a lawyer comes along and says, well, do you realise by agreeing this that what that meant was this? And that can often be problematic. So I'll tell clients I'm happy to look at their term sheet for free, because I'd rather do that than have a huge problem emerge that's harder to get out of because the handshake was done on a different principle. So that's the first time that we would get involved. Then there's a due diligence phase, and that is all about running a ruler over the company in every conceivable way, and we generally get heavily involved in that. And obviously we'll get heavily involved in it if we're on the buy side. But these days we often do what we call vendor due diligence as well, as a way to bring bidders to the table. So that's a big piece, and that's probably one of the most expensive pieces is the due diligence piece, because it involves lawyers and accountants charging by the hour, basically, and there's lots to get through. Then there's the negotiation, the documentation phase, drafting the documents, negotiating the documents, and then the last stage is, once those are signed, is that completion piece where all the bits of paper that need to be on the table go on the table, and the money changes hands. So those are the stages that we get involved in.
Yep, got it. Okay. Apologies for the interruption, and thanks for listening to the show. These shows take resources to build and put together. We have a team of producers, we have some promoters behind the scenes, and of course we have the guests that generously give their time to come on the show. My only ask of you is that you go and check out my website. I advise founders on how to build value and how to navigate the exit process successfully. We have a diagnostic on the website. There's an ebook that I've written. There's a free chapter of my upcoming book, Wantrepreneur, on there. So I'd just urge you to take a couple of minutes and go and check out joshcomrie.com. So for founders and owners, they've spent their life probably up until that point starting, growing, running that business successfully, and then they enter this phase of considering potentially selling that asset, and therefore it's an experience they're completely unfamiliar with. So for those that step into this process, you mentioned along the way there the term sheet or the non-binding offer letter or the letter of intent, kind of getting the lawyer involved to look at that to make sure that it's going to represent the interests as closely as possible of the parties, so that then the document that flows on afterwards is something which is clearly a very helpful tip for people. But what are some kind of common mistakes that you've witnessed people make as they, if they're great at running their business, whatever that might be, as they move into the phase of looking to get into a M&A kind of transaction?
Well, yeah, okay. So that I think that's there's a really good discussion to be had about that, right? So especially given your listenership, which is your sort of highly entrepreneurial owners. So I have spent a lot of time with a lot of owners, and everyone's got a different personality, right? But I think you mentioned it. The first thing is that they're generally pretty successful people, and they're generally pretty capable people as well, and what we can, often in the privately held business space, you will find that the legal bill for this piece of M&A will be the biggest legal bill they've ever come across, like by a magnitude, by a multiple. And they're quite often still using the high street lawyer that they have doing their trusts and their wills and all the rest of it. And quite right too, because they're capable people. They know how to run their own business. Sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes they've grown. They've got proper advisors, good advisors involved, and they're already embedded and they understand the value of that. But I guess this is probably sounds like a very self-serving thing to say, but the number one gotcha is thinking that you can do M&A on your own, and the reality is you just get eaten up if you try and do M&A on your own. Yeah. So even not hiring a investment bots or a sales advisor, never mind the legals. It often feels like you can do that piece on your own. I can do a negotiation. I know what and I've just seen so many train wrecks. I was thinking about this morning. So I'll give you an example. We had a deal maybe 4 or 5 years ago where the owner was a very, very confident human being, very successful business, knew exactly what he was doing in his business. He had one of the big 4 accounting firms sort of peripherally involved acting for him, but he'd obviously decided he wasn't going to pay. He didn't want to pay for the sort of full service, and he could do this negotiation piece himself. So he was at the table without a sales advisor essentially by his side, helping him navigate through the process. And his lawyer was a back office lawyer, really not an M&A lawyer. And the buyer was private equity. So private equity,
pretty sophisticated.
Yeah, so we acted for the private equity fund. They invest in people. They're all about the people, right? So we were having a discussion about a restraint and the extension of that restraint into Australia, and he didn't like that. He didn't like the idea of restraint into Australia. We had it at 5 years. He wanted it at 1 year. We ended up suggesting 3 years. His response was, if you insist on a 3-year restraint of trade, then I will move to Australia on year 2, and I will spend the whole of year 3 ramping up, ready to go, and I will come out of the gates and compete with you on year 3 in 1 day.
Wow.
And our clients walked away from the deal the next morning because when the private equity guys in charge of that deal found out that they weren't in the room, but when they found out that he said that, they said, that's not someone we're prepared to back, we're gone. And that was it, deal done. And if he had an advisor to explain the dynamics of how that works, which is an alien world to most people, that would never have been allowed to happen. Even if he intended to do it, it would never have been allowed to happen. And so you don't know what you don't know. Mm. The other thing we're seeing a lot of at the moment, especially in the last 12 months, is competitive tension. So what advisors can do is create competitive tension. And in this world, as we sit right now, especially where corporates are the likely buyers, we're not seeing that much interest. And if a corporate has the ability to sit on its hands, it's generally going to. So I'm 13 months into a transaction that has not signed a term sheet yet because our sellers, they really like a particular buyer, and the buyer's just blowing bubbles in their ears, and they're not getting any traction. What they need is an advisor to create a process, create these guys, the Cameron partners and the PwC deals teams, and they create competitive tension, they create urgency, they know how to get bidders to a table, and if you don't have that, right. So those are just 2 examples.
Yeah.
So my first point is you can't do this. You every now and again you get an approach out of nowhere. Somebody just wants your business. It's a king hit. Get a decent lawyer. Get it documented. You're done. Fantastic. That's not how the world works most times. And where I've seen these things fall over is where owners just think, this is just all smoke. I can do all this stuff. And I wouldn't hire. I'm not going to do. If I break my leg, I'm not going to try and fix it myself. That's
a great analogy.
Is my point. So that's the first point. I guess the other thing that is again very relevant to the kind of people I'm thinking are going to be listening to this is what I would refer to as sales mode. And entrepreneurs, they're fantastic people, they're very positive people, and they're always in sales mode. And there's a part of a transaction where you need to stop being in sales mode. You need to be in sales mode at the start because you're trying to sell somebody your business. But then part of my job is to manage risk. And a huge part of an M&A transaction is the dividing up of risk between a buyer and a seller. And we have some very established concepts that do that. And generally speaking, the main one is buyers want warranties. They want assurances that everything that they think they're getting is what they're getting, and we against those assurances do disclosures. We say, well, yes, I know you want it to be the case that no one is suing us right now, but there is actually a couple of bits of litigation happening, and here's what they are. And the idea is that the assurances, that the warranties plus the disclosures is the whole book of the company, and as long as that's the case, there's no comeback. What sales-oriented people always try and do is downplay the problems. And there's a point in a deal when that's not the best thing to be doing, because if you say, well, we are being sued, but don't worry, we're going to definitely win, you ain't limited your liability very much when the court case goes the other direction, right? Because you assured them you were going to win. So what we sometimes find with founders is that we say, look, I know that you are always on the positive side of life, but there are parts of this process where you just have to tell you have to sort of the naked truth here, because that's to your benefit to do so here. It's not going to affect. They're not going to walk away from the deal. They're not going to massively change the purchase price on you. But what they will do is sue you if you create too rosy a picture about this issue, and it turns out to go south. So that's just trying to click out of sales mode just every now and again in the deal. I suppose the other one is that preparation piece, which is trying to get your house in order as much as possible before the deal happens. So what we find with transactions is that if you think about the way that lawyers think or accountants think, is that a buyer engages us to go and review a company, and what the job should be, and what we try to make it be, is a dispassionate review of the situation. And what we try to do at Minters is we'll say, this is good, that is good, but and here are the problems. But most lawyers are programmed to find problems. So and in the heat of a deal, the things that are identified as problems can often get airtime that's more than they deserve. But it's just the time and a place, So what I'm a big advocate of is let's have a look at your business. Let's work out all the little tidy ups and let's tidy them up, because then we just take that out of the equation. And these things don't mean that your purchase price is going to go higher. It doesn't mean that you're going to get more money for your business. But what it just means is that at vital points in the deal, we're not going to have noise because someone says, oh, you haven't got a privacy policy. And we say, well, yeah, we haven't got a privacy policy. Well, now it's a condition of the deal that you have a privacy policy, and then we want to check the privacy policy. Now, a privacy policy, as I'm sure you're aware, most businesses need one, and you can knock it together pretty quickly. So do it before we're in the middle of a transaction and suddenly there's an issue around having a privacy policy just when you don't want it. So getting your house in order, spending a bit of time and money to clean up. So if you've got a long festering dispute with somebody, just pay them out. If that employee that you really don't want to give that $5,000 that they're asking for in the PG is just, because it's a point of principle, this is the time to just retire the principal, pay the employee out, and you have a nice clean, because that one employee can make so much noise around a transaction, which is for millions, hopefully. And so
yes,
that's what we're trying to do. I suppose the last one that I see all the time is, so we always talk about the price expectation gap. So it is a bit of a running, joke, I guess. All owners think their business is worth more than everybody else does, and we accept that, and I wouldn't even dispute it, right? So it's a given, and I understand it. So most of the vendors that we work with, they will go into a transaction and they'll be very clear in their own minds. They might not share it with us, but they'll be very clear in their own minds about what their business is worth, and they're largely disappointed when the pricing comes in. And so I think that's a perfectly valid exercise to have a good view about what your business is worth, and it's perfectly justifiable. But the thing I try and encourage our clients to do is to also work out what you need. So I say to them, go find a private wealth advisor, or if you've already got one, sit down with them, and then work out what do you think life looks like after this transaction. I mean, is it the beach, the batch, and the barbecue, or are you expecting a private jet? Do you want a house in New York? I mean, what's life look like? And then price it up, and then show the private wealth guy what you got today, and then get a ballpark for what you need out of this transaction to achieve it. Because what I'd hate for you to do is to walk away from a deal that didn't give you what you think your business is worth, but gave you what you need to get to that next stage in your life, or whatever it is you're trying to achieve, which means you're now spending another 5 years in this business trying to get to that next level when you didn't need to, right? So, or at least have those two numbers in your head so that you're able to have a sensible conversation with yourself about the point at which you're prepared to transact. Because all too often, with just that one number, which is often unrealistic, you might be doing yourself a disservice. Yeah, and we see that probably more with the older owners.
Got it.
Where it's much more relevant. I mean, if you're 70 years old and there's quite a lot on the other side of the ledger about deciding to hold on to a business for another 5 years. You're putting off that retirement for another 5 years, because it's probably you can't be taking your business to market every year, right?
Yes.
You're probably a 5-year cycle. So if you give it a good shot this year, you're probably 3 to 5 years away from being able to do it again. In most cases.
Yes, and if you're 70, then that's you're kind of pushing the very back end of life potentially there if you wait till then.
That's right.
I asked for some common pitfalls and mistakes that people make, and you've given an incredibly rich and detailed answer there. I thank you for the preparation that you've done for that question, because I did prep you on that specific one. And actually, I could package that up and get GPT to write a book on that actually and do that. So if you see that coming out soon, then I'll mention you somewhere in the side notes and the footnotes.
I might be able to find a good lawyer, though. So just be careful.
Yeah, indeed. Did we sign something? So I'm going to call out some of the high notes, because I think it's worth dwelling on that. So the thing that you talked about at the outset is, just because you're good at running this business, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be good at doing the kind of M&A side of legal aspect and other bits and pieces. That's essentially the halo effect coming into play there. People think they're a great surgeon, therefore they're going to be a great investor. They're probably not going to be. Those two things have very, very little correlation. The second is that transparency at the right stage in the deal is absolutely crucial. And being open and prepared to share any of the skeletons that are sitting in and around the business. They're going to come out anyway. People are going to own this thing, so they're going to discover that there's a hole in the roof, or that you've got a PG that's sitting in behind the scenes, or that your stock is 3 years old, not 3 months old. That kind of stuff. And so be very very prepared to share that stuff when the timing is right. The underlying thing that sits in behind all this, Neil, is of course that. There's multi-millions of dollars often that's riding on these things. And so why wouldn't you retain someone who does this all day, every day, and who can give you the best advice to get the outcome that you've told them that they want to achieve at the outset, and make sure that you stick to your lane, which is running and growing your business, and they stick to their lane, which is making sure that you're able to get that great outcome, because often these things are marathons to get from the start to the end anyway. I think I've captured the key high points for me. Others will have many of their own. I wanted to jump back to old mate at the start there, the guy that said, if you restrain me for 3 years, I'm just going to go to Aussie at the end of year 2 and get things ready. And kind of that's a mighty big kind of flex again, if you like. The only thing that I can make that mean is that he was potentially trying to get leverage and to get some more money out of the deal. What was old mate up to?
He was a particularly strange individual, right? So I don't know that he's a great example of. But what we do find is that it's like, I'm the first to admit, I've spent 30 years in a very strange industry, right? Buying and selling companies, and so there's a certain cadence and a certain way they work. It's just not normal, I guess. So and people get and people get very stressed, you know, especially sellers. I mean, I've had some in the years of doing this. I've seen some incredible things. You know, I saw a guy in London once try to throw a chair through a plate glass window at, you know, from 6 floors up because my client pushed him so far that he just had enough. People get very, very stressed, and they say stupid things, and they do stupid things when they're stressed. And you know, I once had I worked quite a few years ago now on a transaction with for a business where the CEO was heavily involved in, and I'm very good friends with her to this day. She turned around to me and said, "Do you ever get stressed, Neil?" And I do. I get really stressed in my personal life and all the rest of it. But the job, when I'm on the job, I'm the guy that's got to be calm, right? You're looking to me to be calm because I've done this before. I've done this before 500 times or whatever it is. And you haven't, and this is big for you because this is, people are worried. Am I gonna lose all? This is my big wealth creation moment. Am I gonna throw it all away? Am I gonna do something stupid? And they do silly things. And why would you do that solo? I guess is the point, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you do, you can end up blurting out stupid stuff that gets your deal canned.
Yep.
As a really kind of stark example, but there's much, you know, like. There's variations on the theme of this one. We also are seeing a bit of a trend in the last few years to, especially within certain industries and especially within tech, by the way, where there are overseas investment banks who are, you know, the global leader in this particular type of M&A, in this particular type of industry. And so they will often say, oh, we can get you more money, we can get you a better multiple. And quite often we now have clients that will go offshore to get that, and sometimes that's with stunning success, right? Don't get me wrong, but other times it's a bit of a disaster because the investment bank almost invariably will be a small deal by their standards. They'll put somebody quite junior on it. They quite often lose interest quite quickly, but they're also on the other side of the world somewhere, and so where's the person sitting next to the owner in the room, metaphorically? I mean, what the local guys do so well, the good ones, is they're your best friend for 6 months. They're all over you. They're almost like a caretaker, a minder, and they help you through the process. So we find then I have to step into that role a lot more in that sort of scenario, because otherwise you have owners that are just sort of left to the wolves a little bit. If there's some investment banker in New York somewhere that's in charge of the transaction but hasn't ever set foot in New Zealand, and you know, so we'll get a little bit of that as well. There's just I think it's like that doctor analogy. I wouldn't. I'm a needy person myself, right? So if I've hurt my leg, I want to go see the physio. I want to go see the massage therapist. I want to surround myself with people that are going to say there. Mm-hmm. Why wouldn't you do that for your deal, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned the person endeavouring to throw the chair out the plate glass
window.
Yeah. I think that there's a couple of aspects that pop for me there. The first is that under duress, people can, brings out the worst in people, unfortunately. The second is that, there's one transaction, people probably make it mean a lot more than it necessarily does mean, especially if it's been their first venture and their identity is tied up in that venture. Who they stand for as a person, what the world means to them, how they view the world is often through that venture. And one of the things that I work with founders on, I advise founders on how to build wealth, but then also how to build some value into that asset so that they can get themselves independent from it before they sell it, but then also have some independence after they sell it. Yeah. And so one of the things that I always do with people that I'm working with is ensure that they don't have all of their eggs in one basket. Build some wealth outside of the business. If you've got a great profitable asset, sure, own a $10 million house if that's in conjunction with owning $10, $20, $30 million of commercial property and having $5 million in equities and a couple of $1 million in high risk things like crypto, just for example, as a way of thinking about things. But having the one big payday being the thing that's going to mean everything for you, I think is such a crazy notion.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you're in a very specific part of the ecosystem where you've got these people that have come through, sort of founders, if you like, and and I think that's very true for them. Other times, we've got the sort of 60, 70-year-old owners. These are quite chunky business. I mean, there'll be, 100, 200, 300. We did the Ritchie's transport, which is a family business for 80-something years before they sold it, and it was north of a $500 million business, right? So yes, by that time they've got wealth everywhere. They've been pulling profit out of the business for years. They've got proper wealth advisors. They own farms and studs and art and all the rest of it. But it's still, generally speaking, at that point going to be their biggest wealth creation moment is they actually exiting the business. And then you're quite right. I think there's also the emotional piece because it's their baby that they built, and we forget that at our peril because I've been doing this for 30 years, as I said, and I can look logically at most decisions that need to be made, but you have to factor into the owner that there might not the most logical. There might be some very good reasons why the most logical solution isn't the one that's going to work for them because there's baggage. Oftentimes in the New Zealand context, which is really nice, there's concern over what's going to happen to employees and the brand and the legacy and those sorts of things, which is really nice. Generally speaking, Kiwis are nice people, right? So they're not just going to sell to the highest bidder. They're not going to sell to Gordon Gekko and let him break up the company. Most of the time.
Yes.
Yeah. So it is but I think your point is try and get to a point where it's not all or nothing, and I think that's right. That makes sense to me. But then you're always going to need to find a way to manage yourself through emotionally a transaction. I think because it's stressful. It's stressful because there's, my brother-in-law sold a business many years ago, and successfully, and I just remember him talking to me about how terrified he was all the way through that he was going to screw it up, to the detriment of my sister and my nephew and niece and the family and the house and all those kind of things, and I guess it's just especially business owners who are so good at the thing they do, and then suddenly there's this other thing that's just so alien, and you feel like you should be able to fully understand it and comprehend it, but it's just so alien, and people are firing, requests and obligations at you, and you're not really equipped because it's bewildering to understand even the consequences of getting it wrong. Like, what does it even mean? What am I, and again, that's where you need to have a lawyer that's onto that. I guess.
Yeah, totally agree. The other aspect of that, of course, which we haven't talked about explicitly, and it's probably for a wealth manager conversation, but for a lot of folk, they have dedicated a chunk, if not their entire life, to this asset, building this asset. And if they are not 75, if they're in their 50s or their 60s, for example, what is next?
Yeah.
And so, this is something that I personally went through in my early 40s when I sold my first venture, and I was prepped for it by the time I was 46, 47 when I sold my second substantial venture, and it was the life after. And, I personally was in the habit of being incredibly busy, and I've been an investor in startups for a very long time, so I kind of immersed myself in that space. And there's something that you can do when you're flush with cash, which is feel a little bit frivolous with money and perhaps make investments that I shouldn't have made, speaking specifically about myself. But I made that my purpose for a period of time. But then once I backed away from it, realizing that I actually needed to take some time out, I had the good fortune to be able to consider some bigger existential questions, but then that led me into a bit of a spiral personally. Have you had any exposure to life after for founders or for owners of companies when they've kind of gone, what does it all mean? Where do I go from here?
Yeah. In a number of ways, actually. So I might answer that question slightly differently to start with. So one of the things we see all the time is for most buyers of businesses of any kind of size, they're backing people, and so they will often want to see those founders in the business for a period of time afterwards, right? And we do a lot, as I said, we do a lot with private equity, and their model tends to be take a sort of 75-80% stake and and then key management stay in. And yeah, sometimes there's a founder who's exiting completely, and then it's the next layer down. But quite often it's the owner, the person that put it together, and the expectation is you're going to do 2, 3, 4 years, maybe with a minority shareholding alongside us, and then you'll have your final exit. And that there's a real danger, there's a real flashpoint there, because I think a lot of owners find it very, very difficult to go from being lord of all the
domain,
their domain, and go and then being essentially having to report to a
house husband
and told what to do. And so I'll be the first to admit we see a lot of exits happening long before they were supposed to. So it just doesn't work out quite often. So I guess the learning there for owners is, if you're in a particular type of industry where there's a likelihood, or you're in a particular circumstances where there's a likelihood that a good buyer is going to require you to be around for some time, have a word with yourself. If presumably you're selling for a reason, there's a lot of money normally that sits behind that, but you do need to be aware that that's the best outcome is if you're able to cope with that. And if you're just not the kind of person that can do that, then there's some realities about that situation. It probably means you're going to get less money for your business. And if you can come to terms with that, that's fine. But try and be upfront about it, because at least have the conversation with yourself as to whether you're going to be able to cope, because quite often it becomes really hard. And then the other thing we see, which is a little bit sad, is when those when there's that transition from we quite often see businesses where there might be 1 or 2 founders in their 60s and 70s, and then the next layer is coming through in their 50s and 40s, and they're going to be the ones that are backed by the buyer. So it's a great story. You've positioned it really well. You've made yourself obsolete in theory. So now your company's worth millions, and you're obsolete, and you're going to sell it, and these are the guys that are going to take it forward. So that's the great story for the IM that's going out, and the buyers are going to say, yeah, we're going to back those people. But then you've got to be, as you said, you've got to be ready for the sadness that goes with that. How are you going to be about sort of seeing it sort of slide off into the distance, and there's other people at the helm now, and oftentimes the owners or the new owners or the investors, they'll pay lip service to a founder, and they'll say, we want you to sit on the board for a bit, and we'd like you to be the chair maybe, or we'd like you to do, but it's not the role that you used to have. And again, that just takes some mental prep to get your head in the right space for that, because it's not I've often seen almost a pathos about it, about kind of wanting to still be in the mix, but not really being in the mix anymore. And as an M&A guy that's done this for all this time, I know from my perspective, I'd shut the door,
yep,
and just go fishing. That's fine by me,
Yep.
But other people, you need to know yourself, don't you, as to how you're going to cope with that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing we see. So we'll see the kind of the period. So we have a private wealth team, and we have a property team and all that. So we'll see the period where, I think one in particular deal we did 4 years ago now, I think our clients have bought something like 5 or 6 properties so far, which we've done for them, including stations down in Queenstown, and they made a lot of money. So there's that kind of spending spree that you were talking about. For them, it was properties, and then it's it's what next. And sometimes what I worry about is, you need to. You're sort of, if you've made enough money, you're almost into kind of like family office type territory, yeah. and you need some help there too, right? Mm-hmm. And you don't necessarily need Neil Millar, M&A lawyer to look over every single investment you're going to do, because some of them might not merit the cost. But you need some skill set around you, or otherwise you can just go and what's that old joke? What's the best way to make $1 million? Give $10 million to someone's son.
I've heard that before. I love it.
So. It's like, make sure that you don't go squander it, and back to my brother-in-law, who's going to kill me if he ever I doubt he'd get this far through a podcast that I was involved in, but he was an oil man and he knew the oil industry inside out, or the particular area of the oil industry he was involved in. But he's been very petrified. He crystallized all that wealth all those years ago, and he's been very petrified about getting involved in other things because he doesn't know about those other things. And so, even just straight up investing in private banks or investment portfolios, he worries about that stuff. And I think more people should. Because just because you knew how to build your widget business and you made a fortune doing that doesn't mean to say you know how to invest in startups. I mean, I'm a perennial investor in startups as well. So
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
We should lament that.
It's fun, isn't it?
Yeah, it can be.
It's fun if not lucrative.
Yes, sometimes it can be. Yeah. I refer to there's a couple of expressions that pop to mind. The first is that someone once said to me, the expression, a fool and his money are easily parted.
Yeah.
The extension of that is a fool and his money were lucky to get together in the first place.
That's right.
Yeah. The second is that I often think about the role of the CEO who's done a succession plan inside their business, either through selling to business partners or through appointing a GM, a CEO, whatever it might be. And I call them the CMO, the Chief Meddling Officer.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's just a terrible, terrible situation. They're always going to set that person up for failure, but different conversation. We've talked about fees a couple of times, and so you've brought it up, so I'm going to bring that to the table if I may. And so obviously how long is a piece of string, but I'm really curious on, like a medium-sized deal, which I'm going to call it a $25 million enterprise value deal. What percentage range could I expect to pay for legal advice to complete that transaction?
So it's $100 million.
Yeah, right. Perfect.
So our base cases, we charge an hourly rate times the hours that I've worked and my team has worked. There's quite a difference buy and sell side, which I'll explain in a second. But so a typical sell side role, $25 million, $30 million deal, all going pretty well, should cost something between $100,000 and $150,000, $175,000.
Oh, is that all? Okay, I expected more.
But I'm involved in an $8 million sale where we're probably north of $600,000 already.
Okay,
we've been going for almost
approaching
2 years.
10%. Wow.
We've been going for almost 2 years. The difference in the two, so the more expensive one, very strategically important for the large client that is doing the selling. We're the sales side, and is involved Commerce Commission. So we've had to go and get Commerce Commission, or the buyer did with our help, Commerce Commission approval. A hugely long, difficult sales process with a particularly difficult counterparty. It took 9 months to negotiate. And a hugely long, drawn-out process around completing the deal. Now that we're actually ready to complete, and there's a big transitional piece where they've got basically there's essentially a division of a much larger entity, so that needs to be pulled out, and then there's all the strands as a result. So as opposed to I'm selling my company for $50 million. We've got to do the deal in a month. Here's the term sheet; it's already been signed. The buyer has drafted the sale and purchase agreement. Here it is, and we go, right, okay, that's actually not a bad starting point. Let's have back and forth. Let's have a couple of weeks of negotiation. Yeah, but that's feeling quite good. We need to generate a few more documents. There's a little bit of an issue to solve, and let's move to completion. Right. So we did a $160 million deal in a month last month. We charged a bit more than when I just said for that. It was probably more like 300 for that one. But actually sometimes the sort of short time frames can be quite expensive as well because we are sort of all hands to the pump. On the buy side, it's normally quite a bit bigger because there's due diligence involved, and due diligence can be as simple as, we know the business, we don't care, we just want you to have a quick look at these things, to a 300-page due diligence report because we've had to review 300 contracts and we've had to look at 20 properties and there's been endless IP issues, so a due diligence report in itself can be $250,000 to put together depending on the size of the deal. And then we also often we get involved in warranty insurance, and there's a whole piece around warranty insurance, and that adds cost as well. It's generally a buy side cost, or at least for the lawyers it is. So long drawn out process involving a bid process could be, $400,000, $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 by the time it's all done, depending on the size, and everything in between. It's probably one of the biggest challenges of my job is accurately predicting how much something's going to cost, because I'm the first to admit, lawyers, we have a crazy way of looking at charging because we charge for the hour. Our clients will tell us that they want value, but what I've found over the years is we've done such a good job for the last 200 years in educating people about time that when we agree a fixed fee for something and we do it quickly, they generally say, "Where's the breakdown? How come?" So we can't win, really. Yeah. It's our own fault. We created a rod for our back. I would be delighted to just agree fixed fees for things.
If you could, what would they be percentage-wise?
I've never thought about percentage-wise. So the investment bankers tend to deal with percentages. Yeah. Ours would be a much smaller percentage than your sort of typical deal. I mean, I think probably we wash out at 1.5% or something of deal size, probably, right. Just off the top of my head. Yeah. We will often offer clients success-based feeing. So my approach would generally be to say, hey, look, we've done some scoping and we think, based on our known principles, it sort of feels like it would cost this much. If you want me to cap my fee, I'm going to add 10 or 15% to this much. If you want me to fix a fee, I might go somewhere in the middle. I can do a success fee. You tell me how much of a discount you want percentage-wise if the deal doesn't happen, and then we'll add the same percentage if it does to the WIP. And it's really interesting because more often than not, clients then almost, when I give them all these options, prefer just time and attendance. It's really weird because you'd think they'd want the success fees or but generally speaking, by the time they're speaking to us, I think they pretty much expect the deal is going to happen and they just want to get charged for what we do, because I think it's just the Kiwi way. They don't like the idea of me getting upside.
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting, given that they're risk takers by their nature of owning and running a business. You'd think that they'd probably
sometimes they do, but more often than not, we end up charging. It's generally a function of time and attendance.
Yes. Yeah. You've mentioned the Kiwi thing, and it's a nice segue into a kind of personal subject. So you came to New Zealand on a 2-year secondment. What made you stay?
So I did, didn't I? So I arrived here in 2003. I was working in London at the time. And my firm in London got bought by what was then KPMG Legal. So KPMG was going around the world bolting on law firms, and what is now Dentons, Kensington, Swan was the KPMG Legal in New Zealand. And I took a 2-year international KPMG secondment, and I'm now 21 years into that secondment, and I've changed firms obviously. Why did we stay? I think we're classic. So I guess we're the classic. My wife and I, she's Scottish as well, I'm from Aberdeen. We're the classic reverse OE sort of tragic. So we came for 2 years. It was only ever supposed to be for 2 years, and 2 years was coming up quite fast, and we still hadn't seen bits of the South Island, and we still hadn't been to Cape Reinga or whatever it was, and so we thought, we should probably stay for another year. And so I got that extended for a year. And I remember in year 4... having lunch in London with my theoretical boss, and him saying, "You're supposed to be coming back and joining me in March, and you've just invited me to your wedding in New Zealand in February. How does that work?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he actually had a letter of resignation with him, which he made me kind of symbolically sign, and I think that was the point. So we spent, I think, like a lot of expats, we spent a lot of years talking about, will we go back? Will we stay? Will we go back? We probably put off buying a house for a long time because of that. But ultimately, it's just a better life.
Yeah.
It's a better life, so we just stayed. And then we had kids, and
they're Kiwis, and
my kids would not last, with their accents, would not last 5 minutes in a Scottish school.
No, indeed.
They'd get beaten up.
Yes, yeah. It is a lot harder in the UK. I lived and worked there during the 90s, mid to late 90s.
Oh, right, yeah.
And I loved my time there. But life is, there's the climate thing, which is obvious. The lifestyle that's available to you. You have to earn significantly more money to appreciate and enjoy the lifestyle you can in New Zealand on a dollar-for-dollar basis. I travel extensively. I'm sure you probably do as well. Since COVID, I've personally been to Europe, the United States a couple of times, Australia many times, Southeast Asia, 3 different countries. And I've observed that that's a context for this next kind of question that I'm going to throw at you. Since COVID, there's been actually a lot of New Zealand bashing from New Zealanders. We've kind of loved to hate New Zealand, which is starting to do my head in. And I talk about the travel thing because, all these places that I've been around the world of recent times is, the world has become a much more difficult place to exist in. It's much, much, much more expensive. Like the States, for example, has not gone up by 10%, as the inflation figures will tell you. It's gone up by 30 to 50%. It's so expensive there. The poverty, the aggression, the division between people. And so the world has actually become, not, in my opinion, maybe a consequence of age to a certain extent, but it's become a less pleasant place to be in, generally speaking. You're not a native New Zealander, so you're a new Kiwi, as I call us, and so I was born here. But what's your view on that kind of sentiment?
I completely agree with you. Try to avoid being overly political about it, but we were just, my wife and I, just flabbergasted at the reaction to the whole COVID period in New Zealand, and the disaster after disaster that a lot of people thought we were having here. Because I don't know if they were reading the newspapers or not, but the rest of the world was truly fucked during that period, right? And so we go home to Scotland quite a lot. I mean, my father-in-law passed away last year, and we go home most years anyway. We were home 3 or 4 times last year as a result. There's not a high street in Scotland that doesn't have boarded up shops and restaurants. And as you say, I mean, I was in France in July last year. I'm involved in triathlon, and I went to the Olympics, and I was there, a couple of weeks after, essentially the National Front just narrowly avoided getting into power. In the context of M&A, bringing it back to M&A, we love to moan about the overly regulated New Zealand, and how regulation is killing us. And I think Mr. Seymour is in charge of whatever that sort of Ministry of Regulation is that's going to reduce regulation. But I think they stopped measuring it about 3 or 4 years ago. But for the sort of 15 or 20 years prior to that, there was a global measure of regulation and ease of doing business. And New Zealand was at the top of it.
Yeah,
for years.
Yes.
For years and years. And yet the sentiment here is,
yes.
It's the worst place ever. And
go to Russia.
Like, well, yeah. We complain about tax, and I'm not sure which country it is you think you can live in when
Dubai,
you get paid less, where you'll have to pay less tax, and the top rate of tax in the UK is sitting at 50% or something.
Yeah, States is higher.
So I agree with you. This is a wonderful place to live. I mean, we've got our problems. Don't get me wrong, but from my perspective, I had a swim in the sea before I came to work this morning. So,
right.
Yes,
and you didn't get sharks chase you.
I would have died if that had been Aberdeen. So
yes,
from hypothermia.
Yeah, either from the locals killing you for being an idiot. Yeah,
that's right.
Yes, or from hypothermia. Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. So, and I'd have probably been taxed as well.
Yeah, it's just for looking at the ocean. Yeah. Famously the window tax. But anyway, Neil, it's been a really rich and varied conversation. I can see that I'm going to be inviting you back in a year's time to kind of get an update on how the year has played out. And also there's some other war stories that I'd love to be able to talk about next time. But this part of the show is where I always ask people in the alternate universe, the career question, if you weren't a M&A specialist, one of the leading in the country, what would Neil have done in that career space?
Well, to answer that question, so in the unlikely event that young Oscar, who works for me and is my nemesis in the team, listens this far into the interview, hi Oscar, I will have to admit to being a bird watcher, right? So,
I'm a bird nerd too.
He'd expect me to admit to that, which means, and also a tragic triathlete, heavily involved in triathlon. So I guess I would split my time between being a professional triathlete, probably, if I'm honest, coach, because those that can't do, Sorry, those that can't coach, and then the rest of my time being a professional bird guide on somewhere like Tiritiri Maitangi. There you
Yes,
go.
I love it.
I don't know if either of those options pays quite as well as M&A Lawyer, but there you go.
Yes.
Yeah.
We shared that we lived in the same part of town,
yes. Yeah, that's
and
right.
I won't mention where it is, but known to be one of the hotspots in New Zealand for kereru and for tui. Visibly, I'm not sure about the new part of town that you've moved to, but I've become a bird nerd as a consequence of my wife Tina. Not quite ornithologist, I think is the
word,
the deep expression.
And actually, because you told me exactly where you live, I can tell you on the other side of your street where there's that lookout point. It's a very good place for both of those.
Yes, absolutely agree. And our backyard is actually, funnily enough.
Yeah.
Neil, I'm really grateful for you coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
You've had some incredible insight, some great kind of war stories to share, and also some really good suggestions for people as to how they navigate this process. So very grateful for you coming today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. If you enjoy these episodes, I hope you do. I love filming them, and the guests always say what a great and often cathartic experience it is for them. Then please do like and share. Hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm open to connect requests, and occasionally get emails from people as well asking me about my experience around certain subjects. So please do like and share, and continue to follow the show. I really appreciate your ears.